Hi, John McCarty here, founder of Odyssey Test Prep. I'm joined by Edward today, and we're going to discuss a little bit about his LSAT prep journey, where he ultimately ended up with his score and how he got there. So welcome to the podcast, Edward.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, of course. So tell me, I guess, where you started off with your LSAT journey. A little bit about where you were in the rest of life. Were you in undergrad? Were you post-undergrad? And then what did you do to kind of kick that process off?
Gotcha. All right. So I would say I did it a little bit unconventionally, and there are a bunch of things I did that I would not recommend other people do. So
Okay.
we can start from that, I guess.
Sure.
So the basis is that I had a relatively good foundation. So I was a philosophy undergrad, and philosophy, like, it's not the best program for law, but or sorry, for the LSATs, but it gives you a lot of advantages in a lot of ways. Like, history is good, English is good as well, but philosophy is nothing but like LSAT prep for 4 years straight, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah, it can be intensive. And I was
For
quite
sure.
good at what I did. I was in a good school, I was in a good program, so I felt, I would say, justifiably confident. So
Hmm.
then I made a few mistakes along the way. I figured that I didn't need a lot of prep time and I could do it alone. So doing it alone, yeah, I could do that part because, like, I didn't use any tutors. I just sat there and did the practice tests.
Sure.
Now, not needing a lot of time, that is bad. Try to think through how much time you need to prepare and then add maybe 3 more months onto it. That's probably a safe bet, I would say. So what I
Yeah.
ended up doing was I wrote my first LSAT about, I would say, a year ago. No, 2 years. And I gave myself 2 weeks because, like, I'd done a single practice test. It went relatively well. And the main thing is that in our undergrad program, we did a lot of stuff that looked like reading comprehension, that looked like
Hmm.
the logical reasoning, but we didn't do the logic games so much, which were a part of the test back then, right?
Right.
So I figured, just, like, I'm good at the other two, just need to figure out the logic games, we go from there. So I had some family stuff come up, which meant that I didn't have a lot of time to actually prepare before I wrote the LSAT. So I had just enough time to really figure out, like, how the logic games worked, but not to be very confident or very fast. So my first
Okay.
score was, yep, 163, which, not bad, like, all things considered. But given
Sure.
that, given that my, like, last year at university, because again, more family stuff, my GPA dropped a bit, I needed it to be higher.
Mm.
So I decided to write the test a second time because, in fairness, like a lot of people, write it more than once.
Sure.
And I got to the point where I'm doing my practices. I finally realized how the logic games work. If I get an answer, I know it's correct. So at that point, it's just the speed.
Yep.
Yet again, more family stuff happens. So my 2 weeks of dedicated practice turn into, I want to say, maybe 4 or 5 days of, like, half an hour at night, right? So the
Okay.
speed was not there. The score
Yeah.
jumps up higher. It's 166, still lower than I feel it needs to be. And
Sure.
then I decide to write the test again. Because of scheduling issues, I wasn't able to do it until August of this year. And by that point, they'd gotten rid of the logic games. So on the one
Hmm.
hand, I'm disappointed because I'm feeling like ready to finally crush it, like I can do it fast, like all that prep was sort of like for nothing. But on the
Yeah.
other hand, I'm working on my strongest sections, right? So
Yep.
this time I'm aware of the general trend of, like, family stuff coming up. So for the month beforehand, I, like, shut off my phone completely. Nobody knows that I'm
Okay.
alive. And I'm just sitting there writing a single test every single day. And that ended up working. It was intensive, a little bit unpleasant, not going to lie. But yeah, I sit down, write my test, get my 174. I am still exhausted. It's been several months since August, and I'm still trying to recover, but, doable.
Yeah, absolutely. And that definitely sounds intensive. And there's a lot of students that I've worked with that have come in and been like, "Oh, I just took the test, or I thought I could get this. If I studied for 2 weeks, that's a pretty long time." And then they're like, "But it's very hard to get not only to understand everything that you're supposed to be doing, but then to be able to do it at the speed at which you have to do it is super difficult. You have to really master it, and that comes through reps."
Exactly, 100%. And reps, I think, is a good word to use because I like to think of it as the LSAT is almost like the mental version of an athletic experience where you are running a marathon and sprinting at the same time. So first, your technique needs to be impeccable. Then your speed needs to be top notch, and then you need to keep it all together while you're writing the test. You can't get tired, you can't get stressed, you can't panic. There's a lot going on for sure.
There certainly is. Yeah. Um, and so you said you did a test a day for like, how long was that, for a month?
For a month, yeah. So it wasn't like a perfect test a day. I think I ended up doing like, okay, so 30 days. I ended up doing maybe 25, 24, 26 tests, somewhere in that range. Because, like
Wow.
sometimes with the work schedule, you can only do a couple of sections before you head off to work or whatever. And like that works for me because I'm good at intensive experiences. I know I have the focus and I pick things up faster if I'm living and breathing and doing nothing but that.
Hmm.
Obviously, your social life suffers, your work-life balance disappears because there is no balance. You're just like all work. And
Yeah.
it is very exhausting. And if that's the way that you're doing it, you have to be quite careful, I would say. So the first two
Yeah.
weeks were absolute torture. I wanted to shoot myself, and LSAT related stuff I actually quite like. At a certain point, I find doing like the questions in the test soothing, like I can use it to get to sleep and all that. But I would finish writing a single test, and then I'd have the rest of the day to recover. Except I wake up the next day and I feel like I've run a marathon and I need to do it all over
Uh-huh.
again. So at that point, there's a dip. Like my answers are not as good. My score in the practice tests is dropping. And so
Yep.
it took about the first 2 weeks for the just conditioning to kick in so that I could actually focus on getting better, which is why if you're doing it yourself and you're doing it intensive, you really want to be careful with the timing. Like I ended up getting it just right, but hypothetically, let's say I needed another 2 weeks for the conditioning period. So I would have been
Right.
ready to internalize and get quite good just as I had to write the test. So
Yep.
always add more time just to be safe, this is what I'd say.
For sure. And so it sounded like you were experiencing some of that burnout, but how you just found that naturally you started to gain the endurance necessary to be able to like really crank those out? Because most of the time when I see people do like a test a day, that they dip, but they just keep going
Yeah,
down until they get some rest. How are you able to like,
yeah.
pull that plane back up?
So yeah, for me, like this is one of the areas where I would perhaps consider myself atypical.
Mhm.
It works to my advantage. It's a bit difficult to replicate. So there are some like background factors that help, where, for instance, I'm just like a straight up nerd. I love reading. I love thinking about these things. My favorite series are like, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, Wheel of Time. So these are books that are like 1,000 pages long that are throwing like a lot of new things at you, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
my stamina for say reading comprehension is already pretty high, right? Like I found those sections like fairly straightforward and chill right off the bat. The logical reasoning is, of course, harder because you're doing a new case with every single question. It adds up really quite quickly.
Right.
But I'm also like I came from a writing intensive program with the tutoring that I do. I do a lot of like suggested essay outlines and argumentation. So it's still the same kind of thing, just more intense, more difficult.
Yep.
I think really and then I have like a decent amount of stubbornness on top of that. So I think all of those three things um, were enough to guarantee that as soon as I became comfortable with the format, as soon as I realized that life is waking up, writing a test, going to work, waking up, writing a test, going to work, like as soon as that kind of sunk in and there wasn't this
Yep.
like, oh, I should go to the movies or oh, I should do anything but study, right? Then it sort of leveled out and I'm just like running on all cylinders. It's not something that everybody will get, and in fairness, I think a lot of people live much richer lives than I do because they know how to balance things properly, but it worked in this case.
Yeah, for sure. And I think almost everybody that I've spoken to, and myself included, there at some point during that LSAT prep journey where you're just like, like so hyper focused on the test, and it's like everything else kind of melts away, and you're like in that zone where the social life does start to take a hit. You're just not doing all the same things you used to do because you're really in that like final push to get those last few points. And it sounds like it worked
100%,
out
yeah.
really well for you. Getting up to a 174.
Yeah, it did work out. There were distortions, so you're mentioning like the no social life and everything. Like it got to the point where sometimes I'd be talking to people and they just say like a regular everyday comment, and my brain would sort of fritz, and I would say
All
it
that.
almost like in the format of the LSAT, right? And it's breaking down, and it's like, what is the correct response to this question? It's like this is not a question, this is a conversation. This I'm trying to live a life here. Um, yeah, the
Yeah.
burnout is like quite intense. I want to say it can be worth it, but it's an experience, that's for sure. It's we're all
It
uniquely
sure is.
traumatized, I'd say.
Yeah, and it sounds like you went pretty deep. When I was doing it, I never did more than 3 tests in a week. Was about where I maxed out on like just mental clarity and endurance and being able to continue to push on. I couldn't imagine doing a test every single day for any longer than a few days at a time. So
It is pretty brutal, yeah. I think it's what do bodybuilders do? They do that like cut at the end of it, and to me it always sounded insane, where essentially they're working out more intensely than they like are at any other point in the program, but they're eating less just to like burn all of the fat. And I'm like, I'm sure you get results, but it's just it seems so difficult, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and there is that balance that everybody's going to find in a different place. And I definitely recommend, especially if people are doing it for like a multi-month process, to try and hold on to as much of normalcy as you possibly can throughout that process, because you are going to have the endurance and the willpower to be able to do that for multiple months on end. Um, so trying to find that like sweet spot where you're able to maintain as much of regular life as possible, but still have this be your like absolute primary focus.
100%. And I think I would absolutely agree with that. I would recommend like 3 tests a week sounds fairly good to me. Like my situation was just a little bit unique because I felt like I was on an accelerated time frame. Like I guess I wasn't,
Yeah.
but like everyone else I went to school with, they've been moving on, they've been progressing in their careers. I was sort of like staying steady for a little bit. I also had to compensate for the lower GPA, so the score had to be
Mm.
like quite a bit higher. Like it had to be a top-notch score. And
Yeah.
I do find that, again, me personally, the more intense the experience, the less pleasant it is. But the better I learn it, the better I perform, and that tends not to be the same for a lot of people. Like my tolerance is just slightly higher, like only for academic stuff. Anything else, like I'm super lazy. It doesn't work. So
That's funny. Yeah, and that's a good point. Just like to how to know yourself and how you study best and what really connects with you, and because everybody's path is going to be a little bit different. And it's so hard to give just like general advice. That's why I like to talk to so many different people who have gotten there in so many different ways.
mm,
It's been super interesting to see. Some I've had someone on who studied for 2 years, very kind of slowly and methodically, and just like was
mm.
on top of it. Like did it that way, and then yours where you have like these kind of bursts, and then the final month push where you're going super hard. Um, and there's a lot of different ways to get to the same place.
And it is, yeah. It's also crazy to think too that like what works really well for one person won't work well for another, right? Because like probably what I'm
Right.
describing to a lot of people sounds like torture. And then I'm sure there are like, folks out there who've gotten like 175, 178 doing things that I would consider like actively counterproductive if I were to try it myself. So it is quite interesting that way. Like you can definitely see why when people become teachers, there's a lot of instruction about like different learning styles and what we found works for, these
Yep.
guys, what works for those guys, et cetera, et cetera. Because you can be like, oh, I'm super good at my field. Yeah, but like if you can't, like there's so many other ways to teach it. If you're limited just to that one approach, you're not going to be as effective, right? So I always thought that was neat.
Yeah, and I've always liked to have like a quiver of techniques for any given part of the test, because you don't really know what's going to connect with an individual in their learning style, and if you only have one way to look at something, there's no way you're going to connect 100% with somebody, because everybody is so unique. So you got to have these different kind of ways of looking at it, ways of tackling it, different strategies as far as how frequency and how much rest you get, and all those various things really do change dramatically person by person.
For sure. And just jumping back to like having that kind of quiver of techniques, it's super important as well because you don't know like where people are coming from, right? So like in a philosophy program, you're knee deep in arguments all the time, right? So like the
Yeah,
questions that are about like where's the main conclusion, etc. I wouldn't even really think of that as a question type because I'm just so used to it, right?
hmm,
Whereas somebody coming from a more engineering background, like they're not going to be as experienced with running through arguments and all that, right? And it's not like a technical failing or anything, because like I mean I can't do any engineering equations, but it's
sure.
just it's also important to remember that everyone starts from a different place and has a different like expertise base on top of like how they learn and all of that. So
Absolutely. Yeah. And, I think again, it comes back to reps at the end of the day, too, a little bit. Like you've done 4 years of reps on arguments
yep,
that a lot of
yep,
people hadn't done going in. And I have found that a lot of really great LSAT tutors do have that philosophy background. So there is certainly, um, it gives that deeper understanding, that deeper experience of argumentation that lends itself very well to doing well on the LSAT.
for sure. And the main advantage is just sort of like you're steeped in a mindset where you take something and you dissect it, you see what's necessary, what's not, what's connected, what's not, what's implied, and what's not. And that's basically like, well, it's straight up logical reasoning. Like that's the
Yeah,
crux of the section.
for
And
sure.
what I also like to point out every now and again, because like sometimes I've started mentioning like my score to my friends and like all of that, and they're like, "Whoa, how did you do it? That's insane!" And you can kind of see this moment where they think about doing it themselves, and they're like, "Oh, I could never do that," and they get
Yeah,
like discouraged or dejected. So yes, I had like 4 years of experience with critical reasoning and all of that, but the way that I like to look at it is if you know a guy who's been doing sports ever since he was a kid, like all of the
yeah,
sports, basketball, baseball, whatever else there is, I'm not a sports guy, I forget them half the time. But if he's doing all of them, right, like he's probably jacked, he's like quite
yeah,
coordinated, all of that.
of course.
If you're interested in becoming as like say as big as he is, as physically fit, you don't need to be doing sports for 20 years. You just need a good workout routine that you stick to, and it's going to be like a lot less fun for you because you're just in the gym for an hour and a half every day, whereas he's hanging out with friends and he did it like over time. But
Right.
any skill that anybody has, you can pick up. Like it might be more difficult, it might be less pleasant. You might need a tutor who really knows what they're doing, but
Yep.
it's not like you need to have the 4 years of philosophy experience. Critical thinking you can technically teach in like 3 days if if the student is really receptive and if your methods are good too. So
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And, I think it's super intuitive when it comes to like sports and things like that for most people. And when it comes to like the intellectual pursuits, sometimes it doesn't seem as obvious. Like
yeah,
you were saying that you read these super dense books, 1,000 pages, the huge, worlds and all this stuff going on. A lot of people may never see that you're doing that, right? So
yeah,
I wouldn't have known that unless you told me. There's no way to look at somebody and to know what kind of, intellectual reps they're putting in when nobody else is around. And, whereas with the sports, you start to see the body change, right? Or you start to, you can see someone's super fit, but it's super hard to see that, like, oh man, that person's like super intellectually razor sharp just by looking at them.
yeah, 100%. I mean, like you can always try wearing glasses, but that doesn't that doesn't always do the trick. Um, Yeah, like the reps are invisible, right? Which is the problem. So people often look at you and they think it's either easier than it is, or you're just like incredibly gifted. And like people do have different strengths and weaknesses, but it is reps. It is like a lot of work on the inside. And I think too, what makes it difficult for like intellectual stuff is that with sports and physical things, like the difference between the strongest man in the world and like a little boy, they can both lift things. It's just how much you can lift, right? But you're seeing the same action. Whereas with a lot of
Hmm.
intellectual things, until you've figured something out, you might not even know it's possible, right? Like there are
Right.
engineers out there who can look at a hillside and do like equations in their heads that will tell them like, oh, I could fit a house in here if I dug out this way, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how to do that. I don't know if that's something you can do, like right, like all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Where with
I
the
agree.
intellectual things, it's just much more confusing. Yeah.
Right. It seems almost exponential, the things, from the highest skilled person in that intellectual pursuit versus like a layman who has no knowledge. It would just be, some of those things just seem like impossible. If you had to build an iPhone today, maybe you could, but I know I couldn't.
Oh,
I
yeah,
would
no, not even
have
close.
no
Yeah.
clue where to start to get there. So yeah, that's super interesting. So as far as like your, I know we've talked a lot about reps, but I do think quality of reps is important as well,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Even if you want to get fit, like there's certain, you know, exercises that you can do that are going to yield a different result than other exercises. And some stuff's more efficient, some stuff is more complex and hits different muscle groups. So tell me, I guess, a little bit about with your studying. Were you just really cranking them out, or what were you reviewing them in depth? Were you doing any blind review? What did that process look like?
So for me, what it was is that, like, coming into it, because again, logical reasoning and reading comprehension, they were my strong points relative to the logic games. We break them down into the level one, level two, level three, level four, right? Generally speaking, if I wasn't, rushing through it, which was another skill I had to learn, absolutely do not rush through things. Read it as carefully as you can.
Yes.
But if I wasn't rushing through it, like the level one and the level two stuff, it was fairly straightforward. Like I could generally tell what was correct and what wasn't because
Yeah.
for me, I found that basic. So then with level three and level four, that became fun because obviously the more difficult the question is, the less it pops up in the section. So I remember I got to this point where I wanted to get better at finding the parallel reasoning because that my success rate with that was anywhere from 50 to 75%, generally good.
Okay.
But if there was something unfamiliar or confusing, I would tend to lose it, right? And obviously I'm trying to get my score up as high as possible. So then I would have to do a whole entire section just to have one chance at it and then do it again because I already done all the drill sets, which is why I
Yeah.
like how everything is gathered in our books. You can do it by question type. That would have saved me a lot of time. But yeah,
Yeah.
so essentially what I did was ran through the test, ran through the test, ran through the test, go back after, and I tried to simulate exam conditions as much as possible. So I'm not looking at like how well I did on each individual section unless I'm doing a section review. Generally, it's like do the full test, then come back to it.
Okay.
And I would see, okay, I get this wrong, I get that wrong. Then I would look at the question again, and it tells you the answer, but for the practice tests, it doesn't tell you why. I think the drill sets do, but the practice tests don't. And
Mm-hmm.
so this was another area where I decided to wing it because my thinking was hypothetically, I have enough practice that I should be able to reverse engineer it. Like it might be another hour on top of like the test that I took today, but should be doable. And if I
Yeah.
can pull that off, I'll have a better understanding of like the nuts and bolts of the question, which will help me in the test. So that's kind of
Yeah.
what I would do. And yeah, so I guess I just kind of did it in the most labor intensive way possible, really, now that I think back to it.
Now that you think
It
about
was a bit rough, yeah.
Yeah, and there are more labor intensive ways to do it, and then there are more efficient ways to do it. But usually, the more efficient ways usually end up costing more, like getting a tutor who's going to be by your side and really help break it down
Yeah,
for you, right?
yeah,
So how much labor versus monetary investment you want to put into the process. Those two things are usually working inversely with each other. But yes,
yeah,
and some people
unfortunately,
may.
yes, yeah.
Yeah, I know. Some people may think of like, oh, spending a full hour on one question is like crazy. Like that's an hour per question. There's no way you'll ever get through, any sort of content, much less like finish a test. But I think it's important to point out, like, when you're in review mode, like diving as deep as you possibly can on a particular question. If it takes you an hour, but you will never miss that kind of question again or anything that's similar to it, I think that's an hour well spent.
100%, yeah, I would agree because it's not like the way to look at it, I think, is you're not spending time on the one question, you're spending time on the question type. Because what
Right.
you're trying to figure out is like how this question type works. And like you said, if you can get it, then you know it and you never run into it again. Jumping back to like the rep analogy, good reps, bad reps, it doesn't matter how many like biceps curls you do if fundamentally you're swinging your shoulders back and forth. You're working the wrong thing, right? If it takes
Mm-hmm.
you an hour or a day or 2 weeks to figure out the right technique, like, I mean, it sucks if it takes 2 weeks. No one wants to spend 2 weeks doing that. But like all the
Right.
practice that you do before you hit that point is sort of wasted, right? So you
Yeah.
want to make sure that like you are practicing the correct techniques, which means you need to learn the techniques. And if you don't have a tutor and you're not doing the drill sets, you have to figure out the technique. Until you've done that, you can't go any further. So
Right. Yeah, well, it definitely sounds like an interesting journey that you went through. I think everybody can resonate with a lot of those, and hopefully, there's some people who are watching right now who are thinking like, "Oh man, all right, I'm in that space where I'm just like grinding, and it hurts really bad." But there is a light at the end of the tunnel, especially if you can knock it out of the park and hit that super awesome, mid 170s score, or whatever each individual goal is, but. Yeah, I want to thank you for being on, Edward. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, it was fun. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you're very welcome. We'll talk soon.
Alrighty, cheers. Yeah, have a good day.
Yeah, thanks. You too. Bye.